Welcome to Minnesota Housing Selection Criteria tutorial. This tutorial provides an overview of the selection criteria that will be used to evaluate applications for the 2018 Request for Proposals 2019 Housing Tax Credit Program. It also includes a number of changes for this funding round. Minnesota Housing evaluates applications for consistency with agency strategic and selection priorities. It also considers organizational capacity, project feasibility, and cost reasonableness, cost containment. In this tutorial, I will provide an overview of each of these topics. In this year's RFP, Minnesota Housing has published well-defined funding priorities that include strategic priorities and selection priorities. The strategic priorities are 7 policy areas that serve one of the strategic priorities that are part of Minnesota Housing's strategic plan. As such, the strategic priority policies describe the main strategic focus and driving policy goals of the agency in the current round, and they will be of primary importance in the evaluation of applications. The selection priorities capture other elements that are beneficial to a project and are largely consistent with the priorities for the tax credit program under the 2019 Qualified Allocation Plan, also known as the QAP. In this RFP, all applicants will be required to meet at least one strategic priority. Emphasis will be given to proposals that meet multiple strategic priority policy goals, and proposals that are best aligned with strategic priorities will be evaluated for consistency with selection priorities. I will provide an overview of each of the strategic priorities, which will be followed by a brief summary of the selection priorities. The 7 strategic priorities are access to fixed transit, Greater Minnesota workforce housing, economic integration, tribal, preservation, planned community development, and supportive housing. The first strategic priority policy is access to fixed transit. Projects located within 1/2 mile of a planned or existing light rail transit, also known as LRT, rapid bus transit, or commuter rail station are eligible. Fixed transit lines that are currently existing or that meet the definition of planned lines are the Southwest, Hiawatha, Central Corridor, and Bottineau LRT, stations of the 35W, Cedar Avenue, and Snelling Rapid Bus. Applicants can determine eligibility using Minnesota Housing's Community Profiles tool. Greater Minnesota Workforce Housing is another strategic priority policy. To be considered a workforce housing proposal, applicants must document need, as demonstrated by a low vacancy rate in the community, typically considered 4% or lower, and either net job growth of 100 or more jobs by an individual employer, 15% or more of the workforce commuting 30 miles or more to work, or planned job expansion documented by a local employer. In addition, applicants must document employer support, including a description of any contributions to the proposal, such as land donations, cash contributions, or in-kind contributions. Lastly, applicants must provide evidence that their proposal contributes to the goals of a cooperatively developed community-supported plan that addresses workforce housing needs. It is important to note, however, that the use of balloon structures under the HUD Risk Share program is still subject to approval by HUD. Economic integration is another strategic priority policy. Projects in higher income communities with income meeting or exceeding the 40th percentile for median family income for the region will meet this threshold. Proposals located in a census tract designated as a first or second tier economic integration census tract in Minnesota Housing's Community Profiles will qualify. Projects sponsored by tribal governments, tribal corporate entities, or tribally designated housing entities will meet the tribal strategic priority policy. For this strategic priority, the proposed housing is located in a census tract eligible as a rural tribal designated area outside of the Twin Cities 7-county metropolitan area. The preservation strategic priority will be met by projects meeting one of 3 risk of loss criteria. Projects that are at risk of loss due to possible conversion to market rate, projects that are at risk of loss due to critical physical needs, or projects that are at risk of loss due to ownership capacity needs and/or program commitment. After meeting one of the 3 risk of loss criteria, the project must also meet the definition of existing federally assisted units or critical affordable units at risk of loss, as defined in the selection priorities listed on the Deferred Loan Priority Checklist. The next strategic priority policy is planned community development. A development will qualify under this priority if it contributes to a community plan or initiative in which the local community is actively working on implementation steps identified in the plan, or the plan includes a timeline of implementation activities that runs past the date when the Minnesota Housing Board makes its selection. Plans superseded by more current plans will not qualify. Geographic boundaries of a targeted geographic area must also be identified by the plan or initiative. Qualifying plans in small communities may encompass the entire geography of the community or region, although the plan's targeted geographic area should be a subset of the community or region. The plan or initiative must respond to a crisis or opportunity and pursue community, economic, or transit-oriented development objectives for the target geography, aimed at creating a more vibrant, livable, sustainable, and equitable community, or reversing historic underinvestment or decline in the area. The plan or initiative must also include the rehabilitation or production of affordable housing as a key strategy to meet identified objectives. And lastly, the plan must identify specific activities and investments by which the local community is pursuing and implementing the objectives. A qualifying plan can be created and approved by a wide variety of public and private local community development partners, such as cities, counties, private foundations, and public housing authorities. Plans that local entities are required to produce, such as comprehensive plans in the 7-county metropolitan area, are not by themselves considered evidence of planned community development. In addition to submission of the plan or initiative, evidence must be provided that a specific project contributes to the goals of the plan. The evidence must come from an appropriate representative of the city or town that represents the geographic area in which the project would be located. The evidence must be in the form of a letter or resolution that identifies the plan and its consistency with local goals. The final strategic priority is supportive housing. A minimum of 5% rounded up to the next full unit of the total units, but no fewer than 4 units, are set aside and rented to high-priority homeless, or HPH, who are house lots prioritized for permanent supportive housing by the Coordinated Entry System. This also includes people with disabilities. Projects well aligned with the strategic priority policies will be evaluated against the selection priorities. The selection priorities generally fall into one of 7 major categories: greatest need tenant targeting, areas of opportunity, a new name for a category that contains primarily geographic-focused criteria, criteria that demonstrate support from the community, economic criteria targeted at promoting efficient use of Minnesota housing resources, criteria encouraging certain types of preservation efforts, criteria that drive certain building characteristics, and finally, serving the lowest income for long durations. The strategic and selection priorities are described in more detail in the 2019 Housing Tax Credit Self-Scoring Worksheet and the 2018 Deferred Loan Priority Checklist. In addition, applicants can find details on what qualifies and the type of documentation that must be provided to support claiming each priority in the 2019 HTC Scoring and 2018 Deferred Priority Checklist Guide, which can be found on our website at www.mnhousing.gov. The application instructions provide details on the timeline and process for submitting an application in the Minnesota Housing Customer Portal. Proposals that meet strategic and selection priorities will also be evaluated for organizational capacity and project feasibility. Consideration will be given to the applicant's mission, related housing experience, whether the applicant has successfully completed similar projects or is partnering with other organizations that have, and whether the applicant has strong current and expected capacity to complete and maintain the proposed housing, as well as other proposals being developed by the organization. In terms of project feasibility, the following will be evaluated: the nature of the proposed site, whether the proposed housing is needed in the intended market, whether costs of developing the housing are reasonable, whether the housing is economically viable, and for permanent supportive housing, whether the applicant has secured ongoing funding for support services. Of particular emphasis for Minnesota Housing is cost reasonableness and cost containment. The agency evaluates total development costs and intermediary costs and is interested in ensuring that the costs are reasonable given the type of development being proposed, and that overall costs represent an efficient use of scarce, low-income housing dollars. Minnesota Housing uses a cost predictive model to assist in determining cost reasonableness. The expertise of its staff architects and the cost containment thresholds calculated through the 9% and 4% tax credit competition in the cost containment scoring criteria. For more information regarding Minnesota Housing's strategic or selection priorities, selection standards, or cost reasonableness cost containment considerations, please contact Laird Sordiff for RFP inquiries and Summer Jefferson for inquiries related to housing tax credits. Thank you for taking the time to view this tutorial.